important in the history of Southall, from being a very small minority in the 1950s to being a very significant minority at least in the 1960s. So tonight's talk will examine some of the major issues of Indian life in Southall in that period. It will look at evidence from contemporary newspapers, from school logbooks, education minutes, health reports, papers of the residents' associations and community relations council, as well as reports and histories written at the time of the events as prime evidence. Now, I think we need to start with how many Indian people were living in Southall at the time. Well, in 1961, the total Indian and Pakistani population stood at 1,780 people. That's out of a total population of Southall of 52,983. So the Indian and Pakistani population is roughly 3% in 1961, so a very small proportion. But numbers substantially rose throughout the decade. It was estimated in 1965 that the number was between 6,000 and 9,000, and the 1971 census recorded 14,630 people who were born in the Indian subcontinent living in Southall, which is a rise of almost 700% in 10 years. So it's a very substantial growth, I think you'll agree. So by 1971, at least a quarter of Southall's population had been born in the Indian subcontinent. And that is probably an underestimate, because you've got to factor in all the children who were born in Britain, but who had Indian parents as well, who would not probably be counted as Indian in the census. So a very substantial population indeed, just from one decade. Now, in the 1950s, in Southall's Indian community had been predominantly male, but by the 1960s, you have increasing numbers of families coming over as well, in part to beat the Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962. Also, the birth rate was very high as well. In 1960, 751 babies were born in Southall, but in 1964 it almost doubled to 1,159. And a sample taken from the 1971 census shows that there were 6,207 Indian men and 5,104 Indian women in Southall. So the parity between the sexes compared to the 1950s was a lot narrower than it had been. A book that was written in 1964 noted, of all the immigrant groups, Indian and Pakistanis maintain the tightest family formations, the greatest social cohesion, the strictest moral code. Most Asian women remain encapsulated in the family circle, at once its prisoner and its queen. You could safely offer a generous reward to the finder of a genuine female Indian Beatles fan. Indian women are tenacious of their dress. Now, there's several topics that we'll talk about this evening. We'll begin with politics. Now, in the 1950s, Southall's Indian population do not seem to have taken a great interest in politics, but this was to change dramatically in the 1960s. Because in 1964, during the council elections, 2 Indian candidates considered standing for the first time, but did not eventually do so, because had they done so, 2 members of the Southall Residents' Association, who opposed immigration, would have done so. Even so, in the general election in 1964, the issue of immigration was a central one. It's interesting to note that both mainstream candidates, George Pargeter, featured here in the picture standing, who was the Labour MP, and his Conservative opponent, Barbara Madden, both tried to avoid immigration as a topic. However, the BNP candidate, John Bean, obviously did not, and he scored as much as 9% of the popular vote locally. So for the British National Party, that's obviously quite a high percentage. But both of the mainstream candidates scored well over 40%, with George Pargeter being re-elected again. Now, the main Indian pressure group locally was the Indian Workers' Association, the IWA, who had been founded back in 1956 for the Southall branch. And they issued an invitation to all the mainstream candidates in the election to address a meeting of the town's Indian population. And Pierre Cabra, who was then the secretary of the IWA, stated, "We do, as Indians, feel we want to participate in the political life of the town as full citizens and not as foreigners. We do not have any prejudice against any party, but we have certain attitudes towards political parties." And he hoped that as many Indians as possible would turn out to hear the debate between the different candidates. The result, however, was disappointing. Only 30 people made up the audience, and 2 of those were policemen. Cabra quizzed the candidates, especially Conservative Barbara Madden, about discrimination as regards jobs and by Southall Council. And Cabra said, "We get very bad treatment. We don't feel equal inside the factory." And this is probably a reference to what was happening at Wolf's rubber factory, which we'll come to later on. And he also asked questions about immigration laws. The president of the IWA was a man called Southall Singh Gill, and he was a very important figure among the Indians in Southall in the 1960s and beyond. But he was president of the IWA at the time, and he urged Indian voters to vote Labour. He told them this at election meetings and also at the cinema showings of Indian films at the Dominion Cinema, which again we'll come to later on. He said, "We are recommending the Labour Party because it is the party of the working class and because it stands for the Commonwealth rather than the common market, and because of its general policies, in particular as regards housing." It was in this decade that Gill became politically important because he was adopted as the Labour candidate for Northcote Ward, and in the local election in 1968 he was successful in becoming a councillor. The seat was a very safe Labour one anyway, and there were many Indians resident to vote in that ward. Mr Gill was the first Indian councillor on Ealing Council, and he was the only one, in fact, until the next decade, until the mid-1970s. He remained a councillor until at least the 1980s, and he lived at 9 Alexandra Avenue and later at 13 Meadow Road. At the annual Labour Party conference in Blackpool in 1968, he won a standing ovation when he gave a talk about racism. In the same year, 3 other Indians stood as an independent United Front party in the local elections, but probably being a non-mainstream party, none of them were elected. I'll just show a picture of Ealing Council's chamber. Now, if you look carefully, or actually you probably have to look with a microscope from where you are, unless you've got exceptionally good sight, but Mr Gill is in his turban, in the otherwise all-white Ealing Council in 1968. Now, most Indians did vote Labour, despite the fact that Southall's Labour MP, who was George Pargeter from 1966, and Sid Bidwell for some time afterwards, in this period, were, rather strangely perhaps, were unhappy about immigration, but they were also unhappy about racism as well. Now, not all Indians were Labour supporters, of course. In fact, in 1968, Dr Mangat was appointed as Conservative alderman to Ealing Council, although, as with Gill, he spoke out against Enoch Powell's anti-immigration speech of the same year. Dr Mangat thought that his countrymen should not be called immigrants, but new residents, and that Punjabi should be taught in all schools to everybody. In 1966, he helped to found in Southall a branch of the Indian National Association, which was more conservative than the more left-wing leading IWA. Another local group that some Indian men in Southall were involved in was the council-funded Ealing Council for Community Relations, which was founded in 1967. Of the executive committee, 5 members of that were Indian men. These included, as you might imagine, Mr Gill and Mr Cabra, who of course were very prominent in the IWA. Mr Dogra was the Assistant Community Relations Officer, and he was also the IWA's Welfare Officer and Office Secretary. The Community Relations Council tried to encourage harmony in local race relations by bringing people of different backgrounds together for events of mutual interest and understanding. Some, however, had concerns about the left-wing dominance of the Community Relations Council. For example, the Indian National Association were unhappy about its links with the Black Power movement. Indians in Southall were also concerned with what was happening in India itself, naturally, as well as locally. So, for example, there was a protest meeting in Southall in 1962 to protest about the Chinese invasion of India, an event for which Indians in Southall raised money to help their distressed countrymen overseas. In 1963, an Indian teacher had permission to collect money from Indian school children for relief funds for Indians who were suffering from the war. In 1964, local Indians mourned the passing of their first Prime Minister, Nehru, and sent £100 for a fund in his memory. In the same year, Gill and Cabra presented 2 bunches of daffodils to the visiting then leader of the opposition, Harold Wilson. And in 1965, prayers were said at the Gurdwara for the recently deceased Winston Churchill, who he was regarded as one of the greatest and noblest sons of the United Kingdom. Now we'll turn to business. Now in the 1950s, there was only one known Indian business in Southall, but in the 1960s, as you can imagine, the numbers grew rapidly in face of increased local demand. No longer in the 60s did Indians have to shop elsewhere in London for their food. In 1964, there were 5 grocery outlets owned by Indians in Southall selling Indian food. In 1969, there might have been as many as 30 Indian shops, mainly groceries and butcher shops in Southall. And an examination of the 1968 map showing Southall's main shopping streets reveals, or certainly in the main shopping areas such as the Broadway, the Uxbridge Road, the Green, South Road and King Street. On the Green there was Sagu and Tawaz confectioners, and also what was then termed an Asian restaurant. Carwell's groceries were on the High Street, and on South Road were Marley's grocers and what was then termed an Eastern foodstuffs grocer and butcher. On King Street was Docal's and Gill's, who were both groceries, and Banvert's, the drapers, and a shop owned by H.A. Dadak. The Uxbridge Road included shops owned by Gill and Co, who were estate agents, a shop titled a Pakistani Sweet Shop, S.S. Gurm's Drapers, a Pakistani butcher, Raja Stores, Sandhu's Drapers, and the Indian Food Fair grocers and the Pilo Caleb Cafe. And there may well be more Indian shops and businesses on the smaller streets of Southall as well. In 1964, Mr. Sohan Singh Dosjan set up as a grocer at 106 Beaconsfield Road, but some English shopkeepers nearby were not happy, noting Indians will trade with Indians and they feared the competition. Indian businessmen at this time in Southall tended to be small-scale shopkeepers and dealt mainly in essential goods, and it was claimed some did not comply with trading standards about health and hygiene. It's worth noting, of course, in the 1960s that for Indians, a visit to an Indian shop was more than just a necessary financial transaction. It was termed part of the closed circuit of Indian life. Information could be exchanged about new jobs, news items, or really anything. And it was especially important to people who had just arrived from India, often with limited or no English, and needed to find their way about by an appeal to fellow countrymen and kinsmen in Southall. We'll now turn to work, and many Indian men were employed at a factory called the Wolf's Rubber Factory, which was basically on the borders of Hayes and Southall. It's no longer in existence now, but it was certainly around in the 1950s, 1960s, and it did take and employ a lot of local men. Now, Although some Indians were their own bosses, as just said, with shopkeepers and so forth, many Southall Indians continued to work long hours in local and nearby factories to maximise their income, and it's been estimated that perhaps as many as 600 were employed at the Wolf Rubber Factory on the boundary of Hayes and Southall, employed mainly in unskilled or semi-skilled jobs. There was a major strike at this factory in 1965 because the firm was opposed to union membership and was very reluctant to even recognise them. The IWA had encouraged the creation of a union in 1964, and this was opposed not just by the owners but by many of the workforce themselves who were concerned over various issues and various arrangements they'd already made with the management. There was industrial action in 1965 with one-day strikes and stoppages and go-slows, but the main strike took place for as long as 6 weeks between 1965 and 1966. And that was over the fact that the management had sacked 10 employees whom they deemed troublemakers. Unfortunately for the strikers, it was not recognised as a strike by the TUC, and it eventually collapsed despite some support from the local community in the way of both food and cash. In the 1960s, as said, there were more and more women who were living in Southall. More and more of them began to go out to work, especially in places that traditionally employed women, such as in Heathrow Airport catering, and in other food industries, also in textile industries. And this meant that many children had to hang about on school premises until they could be collected by parents, because both parents were out at work. Unfortunately, there was some unemployment. In 1963, 2/3 of the unemployed in Southall were termed black or Asian, and that's quite a large proportion because the Indian population of Southall at that time was certainly not 2/3. One issue was that school leavers found it difficult to be accepted on apprenticeship courses to teach skilled occupations. This was because their command of English was often too low a standard, and they had not enough exam passers. And it was discussed by the Southall Youth Employment Committee, and they stated that this was not a case of discrimination on colour grounds, but a case of discrimination on educational grounds. And we'll come to education and schooling later in the talk. Now, most of Southall's Indian population was Sikh, and in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there was not an established Gurdwara. Worship took place in rented halls, often not purpose-built for that purpose. And it was estimated that in 1967 there were approximately 10,000 Sikhs in Southall. It seems that the first Gurdwara was at 11 Beaconsfield Road in 1961, expanding in 1963, but closing shortly afterwards because of complaints of noise levels. There was a proposal in 1963 for a Gurdwara on Southall Green in a former social club, and Mr. Pritan Singh Borough sought permission for one and also for a home for the minister. This was turned down, but he applied again, and on the understanding that there would not be a home for a minister on the site, he was granted permission to convert a building for use. And when it finally opened in 1964, the first permanent Gurdwara in Southall, the local newspaper, somewhat strangely, referred to it as Southall's first Sikh church. It closed in 1967 because a larger site was needed because of a larger congregation, and eventually moved to a former dairy site on Havelock Road, which was converted for use as Gurdwara. And a former Methodist chapel on Villiers Road was bought and converted into the Guru Granth Gurdwara in 1969. So this is a picture of Sikhs at the beginning of the decade of 1960s who were meeting in a rented hall, but by the end of that decade they were able to meet in purpose-built or converted Gurdwaras. Now I've talked also about the Sikhs. It's estimated that in 1971 there were also approximately 822 Pakistanis resident in Southall, 524 male and 298 female, but they were clearly insufficient in terms of both people and money to acquire a building for a permanent mosque in this decade. Likewise, the number of Hindus is unknown, but again probably in the hundreds, and it's not certain when the mandate on Lady Margaret Road was first established, but it may have been in the building process in 1969. It was there in 1971 as a permanent building. There were, of course, some Indians who were Christians, and they attended the established churches throughout Southall. Now, housing was another big issue, of course. Now, in the 1950s, most Indians lived in the Northcote ward, which is basically just north of the Uxbridge Road, and their numbers increased in the 1960s. By 1971, the population of Northcote ward was 7,034 Indians, but there were also Indians acquiring property elsewhere in the Southall, for example to the east of Northcote in Dormer's Wells ward in 1971, numbering 1,050 residents in that year, and also in Glebe wards as well, numbering 3,027 residents by 1971. Indians were increasingly becoming homeowners and private tenants. It was estimated in 1964 that Indians and Pakistanis owned approximately 650 houses in Southall, approximately 4%. Home ownership, of course, provided an income for the owner, having scrimped and saved on their wages. In 1967, the Indo-Pak estate agents was established in Southall, which was run by a Sikh businessman who had information about his properties primarily in Punjabi and Urdu. However, there were complaints about overcrowding and exploitative landlords. Southall Council had a responsibility to prevent overcrowding, which could lead to health and hygiene problems. And it seems that some Indian landlords were trying to maximise profits by installing as many of their fellow countrymen in their houses as possible. In 1963, it was said, "We must not lose sight of the fact that there are Indian Rachmans in Southall. We know of one house where a man, we know of one instance where a man owns 19 houses. Bantam Ram owned 147 Trinity Road, and 4 rooms in that small house were used for sleeping accommodation, and in some houses 8 to 10 adults shared a terraced house, which was obviously only meant for about 2 adults and 2 children. And in some Indian owned houses it was not uncommon for 2 adults and 2 children to share a single room, and in another room of the house there were 2 adults sharing a single room. In 1960 there were 180 houses in Southall occupied by more than one household. In 1964 this number had risen to 805. The Indian Workers Association did not deny that this was happening, but they objected to the council sending out orders to landlords to end illegal overcrowding. Mr. Gill said, "We think our people should be given a chance to make the improvements that will give them a reasonable sanitary standard." And Gill was very concerned that landlords might panic and so might evict tenants, making them homeless in order to comply with the housing orders. Mr. Carver said, "The housing problem facing Indians in this area is a very acute one." In 1966, for the first time, some Indians in Southall were allowed to become council house tenants to be housed in the new properties that were being built in the borough, especially in Mount Pleasant, and doubtless this helped to relieve overcrowding a little. We'll now talk about education in Southall, which became more and more an issue because in the 1950s there were not many Indian children living in Southall. It's mainly adult men. But in the 1960s, as I've said, there were more and more Indian children who were living in Southall, and of course more and more children being born as well. Now, the main school that Indian children tended to attend in the early 60s was Beaconsfield Road Infants and Junior School. In 1965, 58% of the pupils there were Indian. And in 1960, 10% of Southall's school children were Indian, and this rose to 17.5% by 1964. Of the 687 pupils at Featherstone Boys School in 1962, 167 were Indian. And in 1963, a third of both Beaconsfield Road infants and junior schools were Indian, and it was envisaged that this number would rise, maybe even double, in the following year. Overall, of Southall's primary schools in 1963, there were 2,433 pupils, and of these, 533, or just over 20%, were Indian. Now, many of these pupils, especially ones who had just arrived from India, had little or no knowledge of English. Of 85 entrants to Tudor Road School in 1963, 85 Indian entrants I should say, only 30 could speak any English. And many of these only had a limited grasp of the language, and so were roughly a year behind the average English pupil. Therefore, each school had reception classes for the bulk of Indian pupils, where a teacher, who would usually be Indian, would teach them English to the standard that they would need to progress to a mixed class. This would mean that many schools had to have temporary classrooms, often built in the school grounds, to accommodate these classes. And in fact, by 1964, all Southall schools had a temporary classroom for language classes. In 1965, Ealing Council introduced a scheme called busing, or dispersal as it's sometimes called, and we could probably have a whole lecture on this one topic. If you look on Ealing Library's YouTube channel, you'll see a question and answer session with myself and Dr. Bieber from an American university talking on that topic. So if you want to know more, tune into that channel. But briefly, what this meant was, in very simple terms, that some Indian children were sent by bus to other schools in the now enlarged London Borough of Ealing, especially to schools where there was spare capacity, such as Northolt and Ealing. To an extent, this was already happening in Southall, with children being bused to other Southall schools. Basically, there was a rule that only if a school had more than 33% Indian pupils, those pupils who would be in the school's catchment area would be sent by a council bus to another school in Southall when there were less than 33% Indian pupils. Now, in the 1970s, this policy was under attack for many, many reasons, partly because of its discriminatory nature, but for other reasons as well. But in the 1960s, however, it seems to have had general approval, even by the Indian Workers Association. And it was thought initially to be a good thing because it would mean it would avoid segregation and would give bused pupils access to more modern schools rather than the quite old schools in Southall. By 1967, about 1,000 Indian children were being bused up to 6 miles away to other schools, and by 1969 this number had reached 1,500. Now, fortunately, the school logbook for Featherstone Road School survives in Ealing Archives, and that gives a lot of information which is relevant to this study. It shows that in the 1960s there were a number of Indian teachers in the school at the time. For example, there was Mrs. Bahavani, who had served there for many years, and she was deemed by the headmaster a tower of strength since the early days. Mr. Nurja was a male Indian teacher, and when he left in 1962, he was replaced by Mr. A.R. Cowdrey. These teachers mainly taught English to the Indian pupils at the school, but there were other teachers as well. For example, in 1964, Mr. Ahmed was employed as a laboratory technician, and when he was replaced in 1966, it was by another Indian teacher, Mr. Mohan Singh Gruel. Now, although the school's performances and concerts showed a predominantly Christian and Western emphasis as regards music and songs, there's also an Indian dimension. As early as 1960, the 14th of December, the school had, in its grand concert, it had an Indian folk song, the Punjab, and also a folk play by the Indian pupils at the school. And they also joined with the English pupils for a short play as well. Mr. Iqbal Mali performed a solo traditional Indian dance. In 1963 at the school there was what was termed an Eastern concert, and in 1967 India Arise was performed to an all-Indian audience in the school hall. Initially, attainments by the Indian boys at the school was low, with only 2 in 1962 gaining any O-level passes, but another 2 gained merit badges, and in 1960, Shiv Dival scored 99% in cycling proficiency, the second best in the whole school. In 1966, the two top boys at the school in the first, third and fifth forms were both Indian. In the same school, of the 26 boys who gained 100% attendance, 16 were Indian. In 1968, about a third of Indian pupils at the school went on to higher education after 16, and 4 Indian boys from the school went to take degree courses in physics and engineering, although some did go to dead-end jobs at Heathrow doing portering and similar. The headmaster could report in 1968 about the Indian pupils at the school. They work very much harder than the English children. They just cannot stop working. And this was in contrast to the West Indian children as well. However, he had to note that few Indian parents came to parents' evenings. And he also said that relations at the school between Indian and English pupils was good. Some adult Indians also lacked much, if any, English language skills. So to improve, some began to attend English classes held at Southall's Evening Institute at the Technical College. These were held in 1961 at weekends, as shift work in factories meant that many men could not attend evening classes in the weekdays. But mostly young men aged between 18 and 21 attended. In 1962, there was a language course especially aimed at Indian women, and 15 enrolled, mostly mothers of children attending Beaconsfield Road School. And we'll have another picture of Beaconsfield Road School, of Featherstone Road School in 1970 to show the diverse nature of the school population at that time. A more successful class was held by the Women's India Association, and that attracted up to 40 people each week. There was also an offer of weekend classes for Indian pupils in English, but nobody took that one up. However, the summer school for language teaching at Tudor Road School in 1969 was attended by about 300 children. We'll now come on to culture and leisure. And Southall Library in 1962, it first began to provide 5 Indian language newspapers, these being funded by the IWA. They also provided 4 editions of Indian language magazines for their readers. The first known Indian employee at Southall Library was a Mr. O.P. Sharma, M.A.A.L.A., who was the senior library assistant there in 1961. He left 2 years later to pursue a PhD in librarianship at Chicago University before returning to India. And in 1963, the acknowledgement of the numbers of Indian residents in Southall, it was noted. To meet the needs of Indian and Pakistani readers using the library, arrangements were made with the India Office Library, whereby a small collection of books in Hindi and Urdu were made available at the Central Library in Southall, Oxley Park Road, of course. These collections were changed from time to time and have been well used and much appreciated. Apart from reading, of course, cinema going was another major Indian pastime at this time. And Mr. Ajit Rai, who was a leading force in the Indian Workers Association, he recalled in the 1990s, looking backward, what the benefit of cinema was to the Indian population of Southall. The lonely people didn't have any place to go, and they were wandering about the streets in the weekend. So we thought at the IWA it would be a good thing to show them films so they could get together, talk over their difficulties, things and problems, and a cup of tea, and enjoy their home music, and that was a very positive thing in those days. This is the Dominion Cinema on the Green, which was purchased by the IWA in the 1960s. But apart from the Dominion Cinema, the Century Cinema, which is just a bit further up the road, it showed films in Indian languages in the 1960s on Sundays, and it was often the case that people who went to see these films would then go back to their house, to each other's houses, for conversation and social life and a cup of tea, and members of the IWA would make a special attempt to persuade them to join their organisation. Now, the Century Cinema stopped showing English language films in 1961 and showed exclusively Indian films from 1961, the first Southall cinema to do so. But the most important cinema as regards for Indians in Southall was the Dominion. Now, that had been showing Indian language films as far back as 1957, initially only on Sundays, but it was very popular. In 1963, it was reported that as many as 3,000 people came along to see an Indian film at Southall in this cinema. And unfortunately, the capacity of the cinema was only 2,000. And police had to be called to stop the 1,000 disappointed people from causing a trouble in the cinema. The IWA acquired the lease to this cinema in 1965 for the huge amount of money of £165,000. And from then on, Indian films were shown exclusively at the Dominion Cinema from 1965. Now, cinemas were also used for other events, not just for showing films, as important as those were. They were also used for cultural and political meetings and events. So, for example, in 1968, there's a speech by the president of the IWA at the Dominion to 2,000 Indians, and he urged the creation of a multicultural society, despite the wishes of these ignorant British working people. In the following year, India's Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, spoke at a meeting there, and she gave a rather more measured speech about the need to fit in the best way you can, and that both host and newcomers needed to work together with tact and effort in order to create and maintain social harmony. There were also cultural and political celebrations at the Dominion, and it's very much a community hub. In 1969, celebrations for the 500th anniversary birthday of Guru Nanak were held here, as well as Diwali, in order to try and bring Sikhs and Hindus together. There were also speeches from the Indian High Commissioner, who also spoke about Guru Nanak's message of the creation of harmony and the dissolution of the self, which was needed to bring this about. Indian Independence Day was also celebrated here and elsewhere in Southall in the 1960s. For example, at Southall Technical College in 1960, at Featherstone Secondary School in 1962, and at the Dominion Cinema in 1964. In this event, the 1964 event, it was attended by the Indian High Commissioner as well as the local MP, and there were speeches and displays by what were termed in the newspaper as exotically dressed women dancers. The Railway Arms pub hosted an Indian National Association celebration in 1966, and the Cultural Society also did likewise in Ealing Town Hall in 1967. Southall councillors and the mayor often attended these events. There was a concert at Southall Grammar School in 1961 where it was said, "The borough's Indian population turned out in force to see the star of the show, famous Indian classical and folk dancer Miss Kumar Sudami. She visited Southall especially for this performance and it was part of her European tour to give a display of dancing." It does not seem that many Indians joined the many youth clubs in the town, although there was a reference to the formation of an Indian boys football team in 1961 to play in the local youth league, and it was later named the All Nation Boys team. The Durley Youth Club announced there was no colour bar there, but it does not seem that many Indians were able to integrate into these groups, and by 1965 none were representatives of any of these youth clubs. Many Indian men, of course, spent time in pubs, the Red Lion being of particular popularity. So this is a picture of the Century Cinema, which was the other main cinema in which Indian films were shown in the 1960s. There were also health issues among some of the Indian population, especially because some were noted as being suffering from tuberculosis in the early 1960s, and also some had problems with lice as well, a greater proportion of the Indian population than the indigenous population, and it was thought that this was a result of overcrowding in housing. More positively, several Indian girls joined the Southall branch of the British Red Cross and regularly came to meetings. films about health education were being shown in Indian languages in Southall, and these have the encouragement of the IWA. And it was noted that the IWA showed a keen interest in obtaining and distributing the health information teaching films. And if you're interested in 1970s health education film aimed at Indian residents of Southall and Hounslow, there is one you can see on YouTube. It's about 14 minutes long, which may or may not be of interest and maybe amusement too, perhaps. Unintentional, of course. Right, okay, we'll now talk about, I've already mentioned earlier on, concerns among Indians about discrimination, especially discrimination in the workplace, which certainly existed. It seems mainly on the grounds of appearance and clothing. The Community Relations Council did much to highlight and try to address this issue. One man who suffered from such was in 1964, Mr. Amar Singh from Southall, who was an employee of Hanwell Bus Garage, a picture of which you can see here. And he was sent home one day from his work as a bus driver because he was not wearing the regulation cap, which was part of uniform bus drivers at the time. He told the local newspaper, "I cannot believe there is so much discrimination and prejudice in such a civilised and cultured society, and that a person cannot have freedom to practice his own faith. Is it a crime to be honest and practice one's faith? London Transport say that they want their employees to be happy, and to wear my turban would make me so." In 1968, it was still a problem. Employees at Hanwell Bus Garage complained that Sikh bus drivers were then allowed to wear their turbans at work. But the other bus garage employees were unhappy because they were not allowed to wear their own hat. They had to wear the company cap, which is part of the uniform. And they were very unhappy about this. In the next year, a Southall Sikh was refused a job with London Ambulance Service because of his long beard. In 1960, Mr. G.S. Bra complained that a pub landlord in Southall had offended an Indian in his pub. However, this was not a universal attitude because two local publicans declared that their Indian customers were very quiet, well behaved and most welcome, extremely good customers and fitted in very well without causing any trouble. As to other racial incidents, generally speaking, there is little that is reported, but there is a reference in the 1969 to 1970 annual report of the Ealing Community Relations Council. The executive has been concerned from time to time about reports of racial violence, especially in the Southall area. We are fortunate that there has been no large-scale outbreaks of violence in our area. In 1962, Indian men had been robbed by a gang of 4 white youths, and it's not known whether this was on racial grounds, but even so, it was doubtless a very unpleasant experience for the victims. In 1964, a number of Indians were involved in fighting at a bus stop. Indians could also be the perpetrators of crime, and there was an instance in 1969 when there was a feud between 2 Indian men which led to them smashing each other's house windows, and in the same year 4 Sikhs were convicted of attacking women. In the same year, 1969, was when the first Sikh policeman was seen on his beat in Southall. Now, this talk does not feature responses towards Southall's growing Indian community, as this would probably require another talk in itself. I am planning to give one next year. But very briefly speaking, Southall Residents Association was a community pressure group, and they were very unhappy about the rapid rise of Southall's Indian population. And they claimed this was not on colour grounds or racial prejudice, but because they saw it as a problem in regards to issues such as housing and education. And they stressed that their problems were realistic, not racist. And that's a matter of opinion, of course. But however, generally speaking, churches in Southall were generally far more welcoming, but on the whole, integration seems to have been on a limited scale. A contemporary observer, writing in 1964, wrote, "Host and immigrant pursue their separate ways. Socially and culturally, there's little to share, not language, not religion, not values, not food, and not dress. Neither side really wants to mingle." I think that's probably an exaggeration, although there's something in it, of course, because there was interaction in schools, in churches, in the workplace, and to a lesser extent in politics. And I'll just show you a quick picture of the Southall Residents Association, who were protesting outside Ealing Town Hall in about 1968. So you can obviously they're very strong views. And said that this slide and their organisation will be talked about more in a future talk. Now, just to conclude, in the 1960s, the Indian communities of Southall were immensely larger and more significant than they had been in the previous decade. They were not important just because of their increased numbers, although that was of course very important, but also because now Indian people were making their mark in politics, especially, also in the local economy. They were establishing permanent, fixed places of worship, and there were even 2 cinemas owned by Indian businessmen and Indian organisations in Southall in the 60s. And Southall was certainly becoming, and certainly known in London in the 1960s, as a home from home indeed, as the later writer put it. But these were also troubled times with discrimination and violence. It was also a very male-dominated society, with only women, despite their increased numbers, being prominent only as teachers in some instances, as entertainers, and these in relatively few in number. However, this talk certainly does not exhaust all the subjects for the study of this important subject. That would take a far longer talk. This talk is really more of a summary, but hopefully there is more work out there for researchers in this, I think, under-researched and unfashionable decade, yet a very important and very formative decade in Southall's Indian history. Thank you.